Southern Fried True Crime covers cases that are not suitable for young listeners, and there may also be some explicit language used. Today's case involves sexual assault. Listener discretion is strongly advised. On November 15th of 1959, 4 members of the Clutter family of Holcomb, Kansas, were murdered in cold blood. Herb and Bonnie Clutter were in their late 40s, and their children were just teenagers, a 16-year-old daughter named Nancy and a 15-year-old son named Kenyon. They were killed by 2 ex-convicts, Perry Smith and Richard Hickok. 6 years later, in 1965, both killers were executed by hanging. The year after that, in 1966, Truman Capote published his groundbreaking novel, In Cold Blood, which began a new true crime genre, one that was much more respected than the salacious detective magazines born of the earlier penny dreadfuls from centuries before. And Capote had found the perfect subject. The Clutter family massacre shocked the nation. The Clutters were the epitome of 1950s innocence. They were farmers, pillars of the church, and good people, beloved by their community, well off but not conspicuously wealthy. And their deaths were just so senseless. The innocence was shattered. Perry Smith had heard a rumor from a former cellmate that Herb Clutter kept large amounts of cash in his home. But Herb didn't. Angry when they discovered there was no money or real valuables on the property, Smith and Hickok executed the Clutter family rather than leave any witnesses. And for what reason? There was no DNA testing, no fingerprint database. Perry and Richard could have walked off into the sunset with no one the wiser. But they didn't. They chose to massacre a family simply because they could. This seems like an unlikely event, an anomaly, a series of unfortunate events that led to the unwarranted deaths of an entire Midwestern family. But 14 years later, in 1973, history would repeat itself. 50 years ago, the South experienced its own horrific family massacre, committed in cold blood. Welcome to episode 180, The Alday Family Massacre. Seminole County is located in the southwest corner of Georgia, just 15 miles from the Florida border. It's a rural area with lots of trees, dirt roads, and farmland. Back in 1970, Seminole County's population was about 7,000 people, and most of them lived in Seminole's largest city, Donaldsonville, which had a population of just under 3,000. On May 14th, 1973, it was a particularly beautiful day in Seminole County. Sunny, warm, not a cloud in the sky. The grass seemed especially green. The birdsong was especially pretty. An idyllic spring day. The perfect kind of day for farming, which was great news for the many farmers in the county, including the Alday family. The Aldays were one of the most prominent farming families in Seminole County. They had a 525-acre farm just outside Donaldsonville. They grew peanuts, corn, and other crops, along with raising livestock. The family was well respected by the community. Everyone said the Aldays were neighborly, warm, and friendly. Even the Seminole County tax collector, who was, for obvious reasons, probably not everyone's favorite person, but he really liked the Aldays. He told the Rome News-Tribune that the Aldays were just plain good folks without an enemy in the world. The heads of the Alday family were 62-year-old Ned and his 59-year-old wife Ernestine. They were both born and raised in Seminole County. It's likely they knew each other their whole lives. They married on September 1st, 1935, when Ernestine was 21 years old and Ned was just a week shy of 25. They had 5 children together, 4 sons and 1 daughter. And on this gorgeous day of May 14th, at least 3 of Ned and Ernestine's sons were working on the farm. 35-year-old Jerry, 32-year-old Chester, and 25-year-old Jimmy. Jerry was plowing the field while Jimmy and Chester planted seed corn behind him. The Aldays needed the crops to grow well so they could feed their some 2,000 hogs. Ned's younger brother, 57-year-old Aubrey Alday, was also helping. And Ned himself was there too. But after developing arthritis, he wasn't as hands-on as he used to be. He had begun letting his sons do the heavy lifting. Later, his wife Ernestine would tell the Albany Herald that Ned was extremely close with his sons. They did everything together. It's not surprising that he still wanted to help with the farm, even when he probably didn't have to. He was proud of his sons and enjoyed working with them. As farmers, their day started long before sunup, so when lunchtime rolled around at 12:30, they were plenty hungry. The men filed into Ned and Ernestine's beautiful house, which Ned had built with his own 2 hands almost 30 years before. They sat at the large family dining room table, and they ate the hearty spread that Ernestine had spent the morning preparing for them. After a quick rest, the farmers returned to the fields. But shortly after, they ran into an issue. Jerry's John Deere tractor was stuck in a bog. He had thought the land was dry enough to plow, but as soon as his tires hit the mud, he realized his mistake. Ned grabbed his Jeep to pull the tractor out of the bog, but it didn't work. Trying to find a solution, Ned and Jerry decided to go get Jerry's truck from his house. Conveniently, Jerry also lived on the Alday farm. He and his younger wife, 26-year-old Mary Campbell Alday, had a mobile home on the property. It was about a quarter mile from the main house where Ned and Ernestine lived. Jerry's mobile home had 2 bedrooms, one at the north end and one at the south end, and between the bedrooms was a living area and a small kitchen. It was a good setup. A few of Jerry's brothers also lived in different mobile homes scattered throughout the Alday property. They all loved being near their family, and of course, it was convenient because they all worked on the family farm. Plus, if Jerry and Mary ever felt like they needed more space, or just felt like breaking bread with family, they could just head up the road to Ned and Ernestine's house. Jerry's home wasn't that far away from the cornfields either. It was only a few hundred yards. You could almost see his mobile home from where the tractor was marooned. The only thing in the way was a large strand of trees blocking the view. But even though it was pretty close by, it was quicker to hop in the Jeep than to walk there. So Jerry and Ned headed over to the mobile home at about 4 p.m. But they never returned. As the minutes passed, the remaining men, Jimmy, Chester, and Aubrey, were baffled. It shouldn't take this long to get the truck. Where were Ned and Jerry? Jimmy volunteered to go check on his brother and father, so he headed toward Jerry's house. But Jimmy never returned either. Now Chester and Aubrey were starting to get worried. What was going on? Just like the others, they went to Jerry's house. And just like the others, they were never seen again. By sunset, Ned's wife Ernestine was also worried. The men were usually home by now. Chester's wife Barbara offered to check Jerry's house, just in case the men were there. When Barbara arrived at the mobile home, she knocked on the door, but no one answered. Looking around and seeing that there were no cars, Barbara figured that no one was inside Jerry's home, so she left. At this point, the remaining Aldays knew something was up. 5 people were unaccounted for. They called the sheriff's office, the state patrol, and the hospital, but to no avail. No one knew where the Alday men were. The next day at 2:20 a.m., Ned's youngest brother, 52-year-old Everett Alday, known as Bud, tried to begin his workday on the Alday farm, but he couldn't. His brothers, Ned and Aubrey, and his nephews, Jimmy, Chester, and Jerry, should have been there to help, but they weren't. Confused, Bud spoke with his sister-in-law, Ned's wife Ernestine. The men had disappeared, she said. No one knew where they were. Ernestine, who had been so worried she was probably a bit in shock, now asked Bud to call the sheriff for her. And then Bud made his way to Jerry's house. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He decided to try and see through one of Jerry's windows. And that's when he saw legs hanging from the side of a bed. The legs were arranged awkwardly and were oddly still. Unaware of the situation, Bud entered the mobile home's kitchen through the back door, and that's when he saw it. Beer cans were scattered on the kitchen table. Now, Bud was certain something was wrong. The Alday men were all devout Christians. In fact, all three sons, Jimmy, Chester, and Jerry, were deacons at the local church. None of them drank alcohol. At this point, Bud probably suspected what he was going to find as he looked around Jerry's mobile home. But I'm sure that didn't lessen the shock or his grief as Bud discovered that all 5 Alday men had been shot to death in Jerry's home. Early in the morning of May 15, 1973, Bud Alday had found the dead bodies of his 2 brothers and 3 nephews strewn throughout Jerry Alday's mobile home. In the south bedroom was 35-year-old Jerry and 57-year-old Aubrey. In the north bedroom was 37-year-old Chester and his father, 62-year-old Ned. And on the living room couch was the youngest Alday brother, 25-year-old Jimmy. All 5 men had been shot in the back of the head, execution style. Some of them had been shot several times. Ned had clearly taken the worst of it. Later, the Seminole County coroner confirmed that Ned was shot 7 times. He commented that you could cover the bullet holes with $50. The local county authorities consisted of 1 sheriff and 1 deputy sheriff. They both arrived on the scene. They looked around for a while and determined that this mass murder wasn't a robbery. While the kitchen cabinets were opened, nothing was actually missing, so the officers assumed the attack was targeted. Why else would anyone kill 5 people from the same family? Clearly, this was the work of someone who wanted to deliberately hurt the Aldays. And as if things couldn't get any worse, the Alday family still had another problem. Where was Jerry's wife, 26-year-old Mary Estelle Alday? Her car wasn't there. And if she had arrived home from work the previous day, she would have seen the bodies and told someone. Immediately, the officers knew that Mary must have been kidnapped, or worse. Right away, the police put the word out, asking everyone to look out for Mary's car, a blue and white 1970 Chevrolet. But just a few hours later, they found Mary's body. She was in the field of a neighboring farm about 6 miles away. She had been shot in the same manner as the other Aldays, execution style in the back of her head. She had also been shot in the back of the shoulder. Mary's body was nude and her breasts were mutilated. It was clear that she had been sexually assaulted and tortured. Hours after the Aldays had been found on May 15th, the front page headline of the local paper read, "Family of 6 discovered slain near Donaldsonville." And that's how, less than a day after it happened, everyone in Seminole County knew that the highly respected Alday family had been massacred. And they were outraged. Upon hearing the tragic news, hundreds of people swarmed the Alday property to express their genuine concern and to get a look at the gruesome crime scene. People became worried about their own family's safety, and as a result, gun sales in Seminole County skyrocketed. One resident told the Albany Herald, "Things like this just don't happen here. This is something that happens in the Wild West, in Chicago," he said. The next day on May 16th was the Alday family funeral. It was the largest funeral that Southwest Georgia had ever seen. The city of Donaldsonville closed all businesses. Over 2,500 people attended, including some big names like the state agriculture commissioner and the chairman of the State Board of Transportation, and Rosalind Carter, wife of Jimmy Carter, who was the current governor of Georgia. He would become president 4 years later in 1977. Unfortunately, Mary Alday's mother, whose name was Idas Campbell, couldn't attend. After hearing what had happened to her daughter, Mrs. Campbell became extremely ill. The next day, she died of a heart attack in Colquitt, Georgia. Her physician told the Albany Herald that complications arising from Mrs. Campbell's diabetic condition and grief over her daughter's slaying probably caused her death. Officials agreed that this was, by far, the worst crime Georgia had ever seen. And at first, the police were at a loss. They had no leads, no suspects, and no plausible explanation. Everyone loved the Alday family. For real, literally everyone loved them. On May 16th, the Albany Herald published an article entitled, "Couldn't Think of Nobody Disliking Them." It was titled after a local resident emphatically said that he couldn't think of nobody disliking the Alday family. The article called the Aldays a quiet, clean-living family and said this slaughtering left their community in enraged shock. The Aldays were sturdy farming folk who kept their heads down and went to church every Sunday. Salt of the earth people. Who would do such a thing to such kind, hardworking people? Police only had 2 pieces of evidence. First, there was one witness who thought they saw a group of strange, hippie-type men following Mary as she came home from work. This turned out to be a red herring. Remember, this would have been less than a year after the Manson murders and also the McDonald family murders that Jeffrey McDonald was still blaming on a roving band of killer hippies. But the police's second piece of evidence had merit, and that was a green car that had been discovered in the woods near Mary's body. The police tracked the car back to 19-year-old Richard Wayne Miller. But Richard hadn't had any part in the killing of the Alday family. Actually, it was the exact opposite, because Richard Miller was a victim too. Richard Miller was born in March 1904 in McConnellsburg, Pennsylvania. In his teen years, he was described as an all-American country boy. He was a good student and a member of the Future Farmers of America. He worked at the local Exxon gas station. And on May 10, 1973, he was only 3 days away from his high school graduation. But he would never graduate high school, because on that day, 19-year-old Richard traveled from his rural home in Flintstone, Maryland, to the nearby town of McConnellsburg. While in McConnellsburg, he bought some new parts for his green 1968 Chevrolet Supersport. He put them in his vehicle and headed home, but on the way home, he saw something unusual. It was his friend Lawrence's truck parked on the side of Patterson Run Road in Pennsylvania. Richard saw 4 men gathered around the cab of the truck, but none of them were Lawrence Schooley. 3 of the men around Lawrence's truck were white, and one of them was black. The black man wore thick, dark-rimmed glasses. Another local had spotted the broken-down truck too. Her name was Deborah Poole, and she also thought it was suspicious that Lawrence wasn't with his truck. According to Blood Echoes by Thomas H. Cook, Deborah and Richard turned a corner and pulled over together. Richard got out of his car and asked Deborah if she knew why those guys had Lawrence's truck. She didn't. Richard let Deborah know he was going to hang around and watch the guys for a bit, see what they did. If they drove off with Lawrence's car, Richard told Deborah he was going to follow them. Then Richard returned to his car and repositioned it so that he could better watch the men and the truck. Deborah left, thinking nothing of it. After a while, Richard approached the 4 men. According to court testimony, Richard told the men to return Lawrence's truck to wherever they got it from. And in response, the 4 men held Richard at gunpoint and forced him back into his own car. Then the 4 men climbed into the car behind him. They made Richard drive to a sign that said, "Welcome to Maryland." Then they robbed him, took his car into the woods, and shot him in the back of the head at close range. Riley Miller, Richard's father, filed a missing person report with the police as soon as he realized his son hadn't returned from McConnellsburg. But it was too late. Richard was gone. When the Seminole County investigators realized that Richard Miller's car was parked near Mary Alday's body, they knew exactly who their killers were. 35-year-old George Elder Dungy, 26-year-old Wayne Carl Coleman, 19-year-old Carl Jr. Isaacs, and 15-year-old William Billy Carroll Isaacs. George, Wayne, and Carl had escaped from prison just a few days before. They were all serving time at a minimum security prison near Baltimore, Maryland. It was called the Poplar Hill Correctional Institute. George was serving 18 months for contempt of court. Wayne was doing 10 years for burglary, and Carl was also doing 4 for burglary. Carl and Wayne had actually known each other before they were incarcerated together. The two men were half-brothers. Their mom, Betty Isaacs, had had Wayne during her first marriage, and then Carl and Billy during her second. But even though Carl and Wayne knew each other a little, they weren't friends. They had a really rough time growing up. Absent parents, homelessness, 10 additional siblings, which makes for a total of 12, multiple foster care homes, and so on. Lots of trauma and very little love. Certainly not the kind of childhood where you keep in touch with your double-digit number of siblings. But Carl did keep up with Billy, his younger brother. Their mother, Betty, later told the Associated Press that her sons were truants and delinquents. She said, "There may be some who have criticized us for what our children have apparently done, but they don't know what we had to live with." Another family member confirmed Betty's sentiments, saying the 3 men were just plain mean. Carl was originally placed in a maximum security prison to serve his 4 years for breaking into and robbing a car. But 2 days after Carl arrived at the prison, a riot broke out. While the guards were incapacitated, Carl was repeatedly raped. I'm not excusing his later actions, but between his upbringing and this trauma, you can see the makings of a psychopath. After the riot ended and Carl received medical attention, he was transferred to a minimum security facility, the Poplar Hill Correctional Institute, and to his surprise, his half-brother Wayne was already there. And Wayne introduced Carl to his friend, a black man from Baltimore named George Dungy. Although Carl did not like that George was black, the 3 men ultimately decided to escape together. But since this was a minimum security prison, often referred to as a work camp, their escape wasn't some brilliant plan. They just walked off the premises around 3 a.m. and went on their merry way. The next day, the 3 men picked up Carl's brother and Wayne's half-brother, 15-year-old Billy Isaacs. Billy was staying at their mother Betty's house in Baltimore County. Betty remembered how her sons nearly ran her over while picking up Billy. They did not apologize or stop the car. From there, the 4 men started a violent crime spree down the eastern coast of the United States. Some sources say that they were making their way to Florida, while others say Mexico. We're not sure. But one thing is for certain. George, Wayne, Carl, and Billy were on a tear, and no one was going to stop them. The 4 men robbed at least 2 homes in Maryland and Pennsylvania, stole a large number of cars, and coerced several people into coming with them, including some juveniles, though no details are available about them. At one point, 2 young women were traveling with the 4 men, seemingly of their own free will. When the men decided they were sick of the women, they abandoned them in Pennsylvania. Not long after that, the 4 men stole Richard Miller's car and killed him. Next, they proceeded to rob stores as they went down the East Coast. Later, Carl would claim that they murdered at least 2 other people and raped at least 1 additional woman along the way, but those crimes were never confirmed. And at some point, the 4 men gained at least 3 handguns. All of this led to the afternoon of May 14, 1973. George, Wayne, Carl, and Billy were still in Richard Miller's car and they needed gas. Badly. They spotted Jerry Alday's mobile home from the road and thought they saw a gas pump behind it, so they stopped to take a look around. After realizing there was no gas pump, they noticed that the mobile home was empty, so they decided to rob it. George and Billy stayed in the car while Carl and Wayne went inside the mobile home, and that's when Billy spotted two men coming toward the property in a blue Jeep. It was 62-year-old Ned Alday and his son, 35-year-old Jerry Alday. If you'll remember, they were headed to Jerry's home to grab his truck. They needed it to dislodge their tractor, which was stuck in a muddy area of their cornfield. Billy ran inside to warn Carl and Wayne about the approaching men, and shortly after, Ned and Jerry parked their Jeep in front of the mobile home. They had surely spotted the mysterious green car out front, but they probably never imagined that they were being robbed. They likely thought it was a neighbor in their friendly small town. Until 19-year-old Carl walked out with a gun. Carl approached the Jeep with his gun pulled out. Then he led Ned and Jerry to the mobile home at gunpoint. The four men made Ned and Jerry empty their pockets. As Carl stole Jerry's penknife, wallet, and some change and a cigarette lighter, he started talking to Jerry. Carl asked Jerry if he had a wife. Jerry said yes, and she would be home from work soon. He begged Carl not to hurt her. Then Carl took Jerry to the south bedroom, made him lie face down, and shot him 4 times in the head. At the same time, Wayne took Ned to the north bedroom. He also made Ned lie down and then shot Ned several times in the back and head. Apparently, Ned's body kept moving. When Carl came in to see what was taking Wayne so long, he ended up shooting Ned a few times as well, which was why Ned was shot 7 times. Next, 25-year-old Jimmy Alday arrived. He was driving a John Deere tractor. It's not clear, but it might have been the tractor that was stuck. Maybe Jimmy, Chester, and Aubrey had somehow gotten it free. Regardless, Jimmy walked up, having no idea what was waiting for him inside, and knocked on the mobile home's back door. Wayne answered it while pointing his gun directly in Jimmy's face. Then Wayne forced Jimmy to come inside and take off his green coveralls, sunglasses, and hat. Then they positioned Jimmy face down on the living room sofa, and Carl shot and killed Jimmy with several shots to the back of his head. At this point, Carl noticed that Jimmy's tractor was blocking their car, so he went outside to move the tractor. As he moved the tractor, Carl watched 26-year-old Mary Alday come home in her car. After Mary parked, Carl grabbed her and forced her into the mobile home's kitchen. Then the criminals took Mary's purse and emptied it out. It contained car keys and a dollar bill. The men took both. While the 4 men were looking through Mary's purse, 2 more Aldays came to the mobile home. This time it was 57-year-old Aubrey Alday and 32-year-old Chester Alday. They drove up in a green pickup, and the criminals repeated their process. Carl and Billy went outside to confront the 2 new men. They walked along both sides of the pickup with their guns drawn and forced Aubrey and Chester inside. Before Chester and Aubrey came inside, the murderers forced Mary into the bathroom. It's suspected that this was a misguided attempt to shield Mary, a delicate woman, from the horrors that were to come, as if Mary hadn't already been thoroughly terrorized, and as if she wasn't about to go through much worse. After hiding Mary away, the men took Chester to the north bedroom, and that's where Wayne shot Chester once in the back of the head. At the same time, Carl took Aubrey to the south bedroom. Carl tried to shoot Aubrey, but his gun was only making loud clicking noises. He realized it was out of bullets, so he ran to the kitchen, grabbed a different handgun, and went back into the bedroom. Then Carl shot Aubrey twice in the back of the head. According to court testimony, after Carl killed Aubrey, he came out of the bedroom laughing. Billy asked Carl what was so funny, and Carl replied, "That bastard begged me for mercy." After murdering 5 people, Carl and Wayne sexually assaulted Mary on the kitchen table. Then, Mary was redressed, bound, and blindfolded. The four men robbed the mobile home of any valuables, and then they left, taking Mary with them. They drove both Richard's stolen car and Mary's now stolen car to an isolated forested area 6 miles away. Once there, Carl tried to force Mary to perform oral sex, but Mary fought back. In response, Carl beat her unconscious, mutilated her breasts, and raped her. Then Carl handed Wayne the gun so he could kill Mary. But then George asked the group, "What about me?" Wayne shrugged and handed the gun to George. George forced Mary to walk a short distance away, raped her, and then shot her twice from behind. George went to shoot Mary a third time, but the others said, "That's enough." Then George stole Mary's Timex watch and put it in his pocket. Following the execution of 5 men and the brutal gang rape and murder of Mary, the 4 men all packed into Mary's Chevrolet. They left Richard's car behind. According to blood echoes by Thomas H. Cook, the men thought something might have been wrong with Richard's car. It kept going through gas so quickly. And that would make sense, given that Richard was buying auto parts for his car before he was killed. And it's likely that Mary's car had more gas for the 4 men to use, since their desire to find a gas pump was what started this whole mess. No matter the reason that they left Richard's car behind, they did. And it was the key piece of evidence that the detectives needed to identify these 4 men as the cold-blooded killers who had murdered 6 members of the esteemed Alday family. Only 3 days after the Alday family mass murder, the police knew exactly who did it, thanks to Richard Miller's car. George Dungy, Wayne Coleman, Carl Isaacs, and Billy Isaacs. Their mugshots were printed on the front page of every newspaper in the area. The police were out for blood, especially the Seminole County officials. They had known the Aldays for years. These killings, perhaps more than any other crime in Seminole County, felt very personal. The sheriff told the Albany Herald, quote, "If I'd had my way about it, I'd have a large oven and I'd pre-cook them for several days. Just keep them alive and let them punish. And I don't think that would satisfy me. The acts of these men are lower than animals. If a citizen gets out of hand and starts shooting people up, there's only one way to arrest, and that's with a shotgun. I could throw the switch to the electric chair and never lose a minute's sleep." But the article that published the sheriff's quote also specifically noted that, quote, "The integrity of the 20-year-old veteran of law enforcement, however, overrides such emotion." Now that law enforcement officers knew who they were looking for, the Alday murder investigation moved quickly. On May 17th, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's director told the public that they had matched fingerprints from inside Richard's stolen car with Carl Isaacs. And Billy Isaacs' fingerprints had also been matched to a camera in Jerry Alday's mobile home. The fingerprints of Wayne and George were also found in incriminating locations. Between the fingerprints and the overwhelming circumstantial evidence, the GBI director was confident that they had enough to charge and convict the 4 men. But first, they had to find them. Fortunately, it wasn't that hard. George, Wayne, Carl, and Billy weren't carefully covering their tracks. Their trek down the East Coast could best be described as a wild rampage. On May 18th, 4 days after the massacre, the 4 men robbed a grocery store in Virginia. They took over $3,000. This led to a high-speed chase, in which the 4 men led the Virginia officials, following them into West Virginia. But the West Virginia officials were ready for the fugitives. They had set up a roadblock, and the West Virginia officers were armed with high-powered hunting rifles and shotguns. And as a result, George, Wayne, Carl, and Billy were forced to abandon Mary's car and make a run for it. George, who couldn't run very fast, was immediately caught. The other 3 men fled into the woods. After an all-night search, bloodhounds finally found Wayne, Carl, and Billy about 6 miles away from the initial roadblock. They were sleeping under a rock ledge in the forests of southern West Virginia. The 3 fugitives did not resist being captured. They were worn out and required medical attention after being exposed to the elements. The officers later remarked that they were lucky that the men hadn't hidden in any nearby cities. It would have been impossible to track them with their bloodhounds in a populated area. When the detectives arrested the 4 men, they found 3 handguns in their possession. Ballistics testing later confirmed that these pistols were the weapons used to murder the Aldays. And the officers also found Mary Alday's Timex watch. It was still in George's pocket. Mary's sister-in-law and Chester's now widowed wife Barbara was able to identify it. Barbara had once taken the watch into a repair shop for Mary, and she noticed a distinctive glue stain on its back. The men were charged with 6 counts of murder, 1 count of kidnapping, armed robbery, rape, and burglary. Except for Billy. Billy wasn't charged with kidnapping, murder, or rape. And that's because, on the same day he was arrested, 15-year-old Billy Isaacs flipped. He confessed everything to the FBI, and in return, he received fewer charges. That's how we know exactly what happened to the Aldays. Billy testified to it in court. Later on, Billy's eyewitness testimony would be vital to the state's case against George Wayne and Billy's older brother Carl. Also, on the same day the men were arrested, the Albany Herald published an interview with Wayne, Carl, and Billy's mother, Betty Isaacs. In the interview, Betty washed her hands clean of her sons, saying, "They are old enough to know right from wrong and deserve what they get when captured. They had no respect for their family and those people in Georgia. How can they expect any from us?" After they were captured, George, Wayne, Carl, and Billy were held without bail. Their location was supposed to be a secret, but the local papers published it anyway. They were at the Randolph County Jail in Cuthbert, Georgia. It's 1 hour north of Donaldsonville. Despite the Seminole County Sheriff's harsh words from earlier, he knew that these killers couldn't be held in the Seminole County Jail. Too many locals wanted the men dead for what they had done to the Aldays. The chance that the Seminole County residents would start mob violence was incredibly high. People were calling the sheriff directly and saying as much. Some locals were even discussing a public lynching. But for some reason, the GBI director wasn't worried. He told the Albany Herald, "I don't believe that they are that kind of people down there. I think they will be adequately treated." It was a subtle warning for the local sheriff. Now that the sheriff was facing the criticism from the head of the GBI, he came up with a new reason as to why the killers couldn't be held in the Seminole County Jail. He claimed their facilities were inadequate. But everyone knew what was actually going on. These 4 killers wouldn't last 1 day in Seminole County. So here's some food for thought. If George, Wayne, Carl, and Billy couldn't even be held at the Seminole County Jail, how in the world were they going to go to trial there? In the U.S., everyone has a right to a jury of their peers. But if those peers are unfairly biased against you, well, you're doomed from the start. And that is, of course, not usually allowed. And it's clear that the people of Seminole County were very, very biased. For example, consider this. A judge appointed 8 lawyers for the 4 men. That's 2 lawyers per defendant. Each and every one of these lawyers loudly protested this assignment. Nobody wanted to represent these men. But public defenders cannot refuse to represent their assigned clients. One attorney told the media, quote, "I've done everything I can to get out of it. It's worse than a dose of Colomel, but I have to take it. To refuse would be contempt of court." Colomel was a popular laxative at the time. However, one lawyer, Julian Webb, was able to successfully evade representing the men. He had recently sponsored Georgia's new death penalty laws. He told the press, "I absolutely cannot in good conscience, both personally and professionally, defend any of the accused. It worked. Webb was released from his duty to serve as counsel for one of the Alday killers. And it is true that the death penalty was relevant to George Wayne and Carl's upcoming sentencings. On March 28, 1973, the state of Georgia had reinstated the death penalty. In 1964, the Supreme Court had suspended all executions in the United States. On June 29, 1972, the Supreme Court in Furman v. Georgia struck down the laws then existing in the U.S. The Georgia General Assembly passed a new death sentence law that went into effect on March 28, 1973, less than 2 months before the Alday Massacre. And it was death by electrocution. Lethal injection didn't come around until the year 2000. Under this new legislation, if someone committed a capital offense with aggravating circumstances, then the jury could sentence the convicted person to death by the electric chair. So the crime of murder, which is a capital offense, might not constitute the death penalty on its own, but murder that was combined with an aggravating circumstance could qualify. There are 11 aggravating circumstances that Georgia considers, and the Alday murders clearly met a few of them, the most straightforward of which was basically, if you murder someone while having escaped from prison, you'll be susceptible to the death penalty, not to mention a vicious gang rape and murder. Billy Isaacs had not escaped prison. He just got pulled in along with his brothers after they escaped. And since he confessed early and agreed to testify for the state, he never faced murder charges. The 15-year-old would have only been charged as an accomplice anyway. He didn't shoot anyone, and he did not take part in the rape of Mary Alday. But the 3 other prison escapees, George, Wayne, and Carl, did face the death penalty. Their trials were considered a test of this new Georgia law. A local defense attorney told the Albany Herald, "If they are found guilty, I believe this case will be used to determine whether the state's death penalty law will stand up before the Supreme Court." And this Alday murder case also bolstered statewide support for the death penalty. The Donaldsonville News reported on May 31st that, quote, "The brutal, senseless murders of 6 members of the Alday family should serve as another warning to all society that there is a need for capital punishment in this country. How can anyone who is aware of this heinous crime still maintain that capital punishment is too harsh and should be stricken from our society for all time?" And that's how most of the Seminole County community felt, because while the 4 criminals were laying about in a city jail, these residents were left picking up the pieces of the tragedy they had caused. On June 14th, Seminole County declared Father's Day the new Alday Memorial Day. All of the local churches took up a special collection for the Alday Memorial Fund. Around the same time, the Alday's neighbors helped the remaining family members hoe their peanut fields. Without Ned, Jerry, Aubrey, Chester, and Jimmy, they didn't have enough farmhands to run everything. Later, the Alday family would have to shut down their farm entirely. They auctioned off their farm equipment for about $33,000. That's worth about $250,000 today, but you cannot put a dollar amount on the immense grief and loss felt by who was left of the Alday family. Ernestine, Ned's widow, grieved intensely for the massive loss of her family. She told the Albany Herald, "We never dreamed someone was going to come along and try to kill everybody. Somebody comes along who does not like to work and tries to take everything away from us." The AP News reported that multiple Alday family members openly advocated for the death penalty following their family's murder. One Alday family member said, "I didn't believe in the death penalty, but this has changed my life and changed my opinions." 3 months after Billy Isaacs was arrested, he formally pled guilty to armed robbery and burglary, escaping murder, kidnapping, and rape charges in exchange for his confession and subsequent eyewitness testimony. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Some might say he got off easy, but I have to point out again that he was only 15 years old and did not participate in any of the violence against the Aldays. But he was an accomplice all the same. His life ruined by jumping in the car with his older brothers that day. The 3 trials for George Dungy, Wayne Coleman, and Carl Isaacs were widely publicized. Everyone in Donaldsonville and many in Seminole County had personally known or were even related to the Alday family. Many of them had gone to their funeral. At the very least, they had heard of the Alday family massacre and formed their own opinions. Locals were threatening to murder the killers. Hundreds upon hundreds of front-page articles were published in the Seminole County area. Everyone within spitting distance of the Alday farm was now suddenly very pro-death penalty. And as a result of all of this, George, Wayne, and Carl's lawyers came to the conclusion that their clients' trials should happen in a different county. In fact, it could be anywhere except Seminole County. All 3 defendants motioned for a change of venue, and all 3 defendants were denied. They were tried in Seminole County, and they were, of course, found guilty and sentenced to death by the electric chair. Between Billy's bone-chilling testimony, the damning fingerprints, and Mary's Timex watch, it really was a no-brainer. Wayne had even told an FBI agent that he shot 19-year-old Richard Wayne Miller because he, quote, didn't want any witnesses, and then he helped the authorities find the body. It was so obvious that these men had committed these crimes, their lawyers didn't even try to argue their innocence. They all just argued that their clients should not receive the death penalty. And to be honest, it doesn't look like they argued very hard. And it's hard to blame them. Numerous reports said that during Wayne's arraignment, he chuckled when the judge read him his list of charges. If ever there was evil in this world, it was probably these guys. And they needed to be locked up. Luckily, the juries felt the same. For each of George, Wayne, and Carl's separate trials, the 3 different juries took less than an hour to reach their guilty verdicts. At this point, you might be thinking, hey, that sounds like good news. But it's not. And that's because in 1985, a federal appeals court determined that their juries were biased due to rampant pretrial publicity. This was a huge deal in Georgia. Everyone was furious. In fact, over 100,000 Georgians signed a petition to have the appeals court judge that made that call impeached. But the U.S. House of Representatives rejected that petition. The judge did admit publicly that the men were clearly guilty, but he couldn't believe that they had received an impartial jury, which was their constitutional right. Now, George, Wayne, and Carl would receive new trials, new verdicts, and if convicted, once more, new sentences. First up was 33-year-old Carl Jr. Isaacs. In early 1988, Carl was again convicted and sentenced to death. This was an especially easy decision for the jury, and for a few good reasons. First of all, Carl confessed to the murders and rape while giving an interview to a filmmaker for a documentary on the Alday family massacre. As in, that moron sat in front of a recording camera and said he did it, and then he walked into a courtroom thinking he might get away scot-free. That's not how this works, Carl. Additionally, Carl had also orchestrated 2 separate prison breaks while incarcerated between 1974 and 1988. Carl was never able to get himself out, but he did help others escape. In the 1974 attempt, he smuggled in hacksaw blades, pajamas, shoes, belts, and other illicit items into his prison cell. He crafted makeshift guard uniforms from the clothes, and he used the hacksaw blades to slowly saw through the bars of the prison windows. He concealed his progress with bubblegum, paint, and cardboard. On the day of the escape, Carl and his friends would change into their fake uniforms and exit their cell through the windows that led to the roof. Then, they would get in an empty car in the parking lot which had been left for them earlier by a friend. But Carl never got to see his magnificent plan unfold. Because 2 hours before the escape was going to happen, he was transferred to a different prison. Carl wrote a 46-page statement about this escape attempt. Here's a standout line. Herein lies the truthful story about one of the greatest escapes that has ever been recorded in the annals of history. Perhaps it could even be the greatest. The second prison break Carl attempted, or I guess it's the third if we're counting his 1973 break, was equally complicated and crazy. But long story short, Carl was caught when a guard noticed that his ventilation duct was a slightly different color than the rest of his cell. Carl had been trying to cut his way through to get to the outside world. On a different occasion, before Georgia passed a law banning death row inmates from speaking to the media, Carl told reporters that he did not regret killing the Aldays. He said, quote, "I'd like to get out and kill more of them. They represent the type of society I don't like. They love church so damn much. Working people don't do a damn thing for me." Carl also said that he would kill his brother Billy in a heartbeat for betraying him. His exact words were, "If he were free and I were free, he would be the first person I would kill. Have I told you how much I'd love to kill little Billy? I started to kill him several times, but I didn't, and I should have killed him." Carl's lack of remorse for his wrongdoing would be the final nail in his coffin. No jury wanted to see this man walk free. 49-year-old Carl Jr. Isaacs was executed on May 6, 2003 by lethal injection, just over 3 years too late for old Sparky, and almost 30 years to the day of the Alday Massacre. Carl's final meal was a regular institutional tray of pork and macaroni, pinto beans, cabbage, carrot salad, a dinner roll, chocolate cake, and fruit punch. But he pushed the meal away. All in all, he had spent 29 years and 102 days on death row. This made Carl one of the longest-serving death row inmates in the U.S. In May of 1988, the same year Carl was reconvicted, Wayne had his retrial in DeKalb County. He was convicted easily, but the jury struggled with giving him the death penalty. After 7 days of deliberation, the jury was deadlocked, so the judge sentenced 40-year-old Wayne Carl Coleman to 6 consecutive life sentences in prison. Today, he's 75 years old and in Wilcox State Prison. And in July of 1988, 50-year-old George Elder Dungy pled guilty on all counts in Muskogee County. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms and 3 concurrent life terms. He died in prison in 2006 at age 68. 36-year-old Billy Carroll Isaacs was released from prison in April of 1994 after serving for almost 21 years. He was originally sentenced to 40 years, but his case was, logistically, a little weird. He was imprisoned for 2 decades starting at age 15 for, technically, armed robbery and burglary. With all that in mind, plus his repeated testimony appearances, I'm not surprised that they let him out early. Despite his presence that horrific day in Georgia, he always sought to do right by the Alday family afterward. But he still died young, at the age of 51 in Florida on May 4th, 2009. Even though the Alday murderers are imprisoned or dead, their impact will last lifetimes. Decades after the Alday family massacre, members of the Alday family told the Associated Press that Seminole County was still changed forever. Before, it was a place of innocence. Now, people still have 2 or 3 locks on their doors. And probably an entire generation of Alday descendants were lost. All because 3 evil men escaped prison and then ran out of gas that fateful day 50 years ago. Southern Fried True Crime is hosted and produced by me, Erica Kelley. Today's episode was researched and written by Andrea Marshbank, with additional writing by me, and of course, all editorial opinions are my own. Southern Fried's original music is by Rob Harrison of Gamma Radio, and the original graphic art is by Coley Horner. Today's episode was edited and mixed by Brandon Schexnayder of Southern Gothic and Erica Kelley. If you have any case suggestions, please go to my website and click on the Listener Suggestion tab. or email sftcresearch@gmail.com. You'll get lost in a sea of emails if you send it to my main address, so this is the best way for me to get those little-known cases y'all always send me. Please remember that I do not accept suggestions on social media private messaging. With 3 platforms to manage, that is very overwhelming for me. I hope you understand. But please come join our Facebook group, Southern Fried True Crime Fans Discussion Group, where we swap recipes, worship Dolly Parton, and share memes. I much prefer spending my social media time in our lovely group. We do, of course, discuss true crime, not just Southern Fried, but all kinds, but it is still very much a Southern lifestyle group. Our group is a safe and fun corner of Facebook, and by God, we mean it when we say no shit asses allowed. It's not just a motto, it is how we run the group. If you enjoyed today's show, don't forget to subscribe and please tell a friend or rate and review on iTunes. I'm also on all large platforms like iHeart, Stitcher, Spotify, Spreaker, and now Amazon and Audible. You can also find me on YouTube, as well as listen through my website, southernfriedtruecrime.com. Until next time, thanks so much for listening. Y'all take care.